You won't believe what just happened at the National Education Forum. It was supposed to be a calm, policy-driven debate, a panel on education reform with experts, senators, students, and of course, the press. But what unfolded on that stage? It turned into something no one expected. A moment that lit up social media, flipped the narrative, and shook one of the most seasoned senators in America. The convention center buzzed with anticipation. Bright lights beamed down on the stage. Cameras from CNN, Fox, and independent live streamers scanned the crowd. Everyone had their phones ready, expecting facts, numbers, and maybe a few pointed exchanges. But not this. Seated at center stage were two women generations apart, ideologically opposed. Senator Elizabeth Warren, confident, calculated, and known for her fiery speeches on public education. And across from her, Karoline Leavitt, the 27-year-old White House press secretary, a rising star often underestimated for her youth. Tension hung in the air like the moment before thunder. Warren adjusted her microphone, smiled faintly, and began. Her voice was steady, practiced. She spoke of equity, opportunity, and systemic reform. She called out past administrations, demanding more funding for public schools and railing against privatization. The audience, mostly educators and journalists, nodded in approval. But then, something shifted. Warren glanced sideways at Leavitt. Her smile tightened, and with a tone just sharp enough to cut, she said, "I do wonder whether someone whose experience is mostly tweeting press releases truly understands the challenges of our education system." Laughter rippled through one side of the room. Reporters raised their eyebrows. A few phones captured the smirk on Warren's face. And just like that, it was no longer just a forum. It was a public test, a challenge. Karoline didn't flinch, but behind her stillness, something stirred. The cameras panned in. The audience grew quiet. Even Warren tilted her head slightly, as if waiting to see if the girl across from her would crumble or rise. What came next would not only define this event, it would become a cultural moment. Because Karoline Leavitt wasn't about to just sit there and smile. Not this time. The room shifted. Warren's jab had landed no question. Her voice had the edge of a law professor mid-lecture, and her supporters knew it. One leaned back in their seat, smirking. Another whispered to a colleague, "She really went there." Karoline Leavitt stayed silent, but something in her posture changed, barely noticeable, unless you knew what to look for. She wasn't shaken. She was calculating, focused. Behind her composed exterior, a flood of memories stirred. She remembered being 17, standing in a freezing gymnasium in rural New Hampshire, handing out flyers for a local school board election. Her parents couldn't afford private tutors or prep schools, but they gave her something else belief. They told her that education was the one thing no one could ever take away from you. She remembered being mocked on cable news for being too young, too green, when she became the youngest White House press secretary in modern history. But while others were sleeping, she was writing, studying, listening. Warren wasn't the first to look down on her. She wouldn't be the last. But this time was different. Because now, the cameras were rolling. Millions were watching. And somewhere out there, a 16-year-old girl with big dreams and a thick skin was waiting to see what Karoline would do next. Warren pressed on. "This administration," she said, her tone growing sharper, "seems to think education is a game of optics, as if a well-crafted tweet could replace a child's textbook. I'm not even sure Miss Leavitt has the credentials to be here today, much less speak for America's students." A few chuckles echoed from the press row. A low murmur spread through the crowd. Was this still about policy, or had it turned personal? A White House aide leaned forward, whispering, "She's not going to take that." And she wasn't. Karoline's fingers gently tapped the edge of her podium. Her jaw tightened, just slightly. She scanned the crowd, not the critics, not the pundits, but the students in the back row, the ones scribbling notes, the ones who hadn't looked away since Warren spoke. They were the reason she was here. This wasn't just about education anymore. It was about dignity, voice, presence. Karoline took a breath. And then she reached for the microphone. The microphone picked up a faint breath. Karoline Leavitt leaned in. Her voice didn't crack, didn't waver. It cut through the silence like a clean blade. "Senator Warren," she began, steady and calm, "I didn't come here to compete in a resume contest. I came here to talk about kids." A ripple passed through the room, not applause, not yet, but a quiet recognition that the mood had changed. She continued, her tone firm but never raised. "You question my credentials. Fair. Let me offer them. I was the first in my family to attend college on a scholarship earned through 2 part-time jobs and a pile of student loans. I've seen what a broken education system looks like from the inside, not from a Senate chamber, but from a crowded classroom with outdated books and no heat." Eyes in the room turned. Reporters lifted their pens. Students leaned forward. "I've been underestimated my entire career," she said, looking directly at Warren, "because of my age, my background, my audacity to believe I belonged in rooms people said I didn't earn. But I earned this podium. Not with tweets, with work." Somewhere in the crowd, a teacher nodded slowly. "My generation," Karoline pressed on, "isn't waiting for permission to lead. We're already here. And we're not here to tear down public schools. We're here to rebuild them. Smarter, fairer, stronger. Because we lived the gaps. We lived the underfunding. We lived the wait lists." The tension shifted. Warren's smirk was gone. She stood still, poker-faced, but her fingers clutched her notes tighter. Karoline turned to the students in the back row, her voice softening. "You're not too young. You're not too late. You're not too anything. Don't let anyone tell you that you need 30 years in Washington before your voice matters." Applause broke through at first from the corners, then a swell through the center rows. Cameras zoomed in. Phones rose. A Fox News anchor whispered to their producer, "We've got our headline." Karoline took one last breath before finishing. "I didn't come here to fight a senator. I came here to fight for students. And if my age is a problem, maybe it's time we redefine what leadership really looks like." The room erupted. Applause, cheers, standing ovations, even from unexpected places. And for the first time all afternoon, Senator Warren had nothing to say. The applause was still rolling when Karoline stepped back from the mic. But she didn't smile. She didn't need to. The moment wasn't about celebration, it was about clarity. She had just redrawn the battlefield, not with volume, but with vision. Senator Warren stood silent for a beat too long. Then, with the calm of someone who'd survived 1,000 debates, she stepped forward, flipping through her notes. Her voice was quieter, now colder. "Miss Leavitt," she said, "your story is touching, but emotion doesn't fix broken schools. The fact remains, this administration has proposed budget cuts that will take money away from the very classrooms you say you care about." The crowd hushed again. Just like that, Warren pivoted. No more jabs about age. Now it was about policy, her home turf. Reporters perked up, cameras tilted. This wasn't over. Warren narrowed her eyes. Parents across the country are worried. Teachers are exhausted. And now we're funneling funds into private institutions while public schools starve. That's not leadership. That's abandonment. A few murmurs of agreement echoed from the audience. Some clapped. The momentum wavered. Karoline stood still, but not because she was stunned. She was thinking, fast. Because Warren was smart. This wasn't personal anymore. It was strategic. She'd shifted the fight from Karoline's identity to the administration's record, trying to frame Leavitt as nothing more than a polished spokesperson defending unpopular policies. And Karoline knew it. She stepped up again, slowly. Her voice was gentler this time, but no less resolute. "I understand those fears, Senator. I've lived them," she said, locking eyes with a teacher in the second row. "My parents counted every dollar when I was growing up. We didn't have tutors. We didn't have choices. We had one underfunded school, and we prayed it would be enough." The room was quiet. But let me be clear. Choice isn't abandonment. It's equity. It's giving a family in South Boston or rural Iowa the right to find what works, whether that's public, private, or vocational. We're not defunding the dream. We're rethinking how we deliver it. A father in the audience clapped, once loud, certain. Others followed. Karoline turned back to Warren. "I respect your experience. But if experience means refusing to evolve, then maybe experience isn't what we need right now." And once again, The tide turned. The energy in the room shifted again, a pendulum swinging faster than anyone could predict. Reporters who'd come expecting a sleepy policy discussion now found themselves at the center of a national moment. Tweets flew. Hashtags formed. The crowd, once politely observant, had become electrified. And Senator Warren felt it. She wasn't rattled yet, but her eyes, sharp and experienced, scanned the crowd. She could feel the applause bending away from her. Slowly, quietly, dangerously. She had to act. She leaned in, voice lowered but laced with precision. "Miss Leavitt," she said, "no one here doubts your story. But stories don't build schools. Numbers do. Policy does. And the policy your administration pushes is stripping resources from the very children you claim to fight for." She paused, letting the words sink in like ice water. "Is that your version of equity?" A few audience members nodded, almost relieved Warren had taken back the mic. A veteran reporter from a center-left publication whispered to his colleague, "She's going for the technical knockout." But Karoline didn't blink. She raised her chin, stepped forward, and spoke not with defiance, but with clarity that felt carved in stone. "You're right, Senator. Numbers matter. So let's talk numbers." The room leaned in. Over $100 billion in federal education funding, and we're still watching schools fail. Why? Because the system isn't broken from lack of money, it's broken from lack of vision, bureaucracy, inflexibility, one-size-fits-all mandates that choke innovation and crush local control. A ripple passed through the educators in the audience. Karoline pressed on. "You speak of public schools like they're sacred ground. I respect that. But sacred doesn't mean untouchable. It means we fight to make them work, or we give families the freedom to find what does." Then she paused, and her eyes, steady and unwavering, met Warren's. "You've been in Washington for decades. I grew up in a classroom where the ceiling leaked and the heater broke every winter. I'm not here to defend failure. I'm here to challenge it." And that's when it happened. A teacher in the third row stood up slowly and began clapping. Not for the politics, but for the truth. More joined in. The applause wasn't explosive, not yet, but it was building, like pressure behind a dam. And on that stage, for the first time, Senator Warren looked outflanked. Warren's jaw tensed just for a moment. She had faced senators, governors, even billionaires. But this was something different. Karoline Leavitt wasn't playing by the old rules. She wasn't deferential. She wasn't defensive. She was unshakable. And the crowd could feel it. Still, Warren wasn't finished. She stepped closer to the microphone. This time, her voice more forceful, aiming not at Karoline, but through her. "You talk about freedom and choice," Warren said. "But what you're defending is the funneling of taxpayer dollars into private hands. Charter networks, religious academies, institutions that don't serve every child, only the ones they choose to admit." She looked out at the audience, her voice rising. "That's not equity. That's escape. And it leaves the most vulnerable behind." Scattered applause broke out mostly from her supporters seated near the front. But it wasn't the confident wave it once was. It sounded tired, rehearsed. Karoline stood still. She could have fired back instantly, but she didn't. She let the silence stretch long enough for people to sit in Warren's words. Then she lifted her chin, eyes calm, voice firm. "Senator, I understand the fear of abandonment. I lived it. But let me ask you something." She stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on the podium. "If a public school fails a child year after year, how long should that child wait for reform? How many grades should they repeat? How many futures should we sacrifice in the name of protecting the system?" No one moved. That's not escape. That's rescue. Now the crowd shifted. Again, murmurs, quiet gasps. Even a few of Warren's former applauders lowered their eyes. Karoline continued, "I believe in public education, but I also believe in parents, in local leaders, in students who don't have time to wait for a 10-year reform plan when they need help today." She let the words land, then delivered the final blow. "You say I'm funneling funds into private hands. I say I'm giving families a ladder out of broken promises." The silence was heavier than before. And then a student in the back row stood up, clapped once, and shouted, "That's right!" A few more followed, then dozens. And just like that, the applause broke loose again. Warren looked out not at Leavitt but at the audience that was slowly slipping through her fingers. Senator Warren adjusted her notes, but the paper trembled slightly in her hand. She saw it, the shift in the audience. Students on their feet, teachers clapping with hesitant conviction. Even a few journalists were no longer scribbling critiques, but tracking something else entirely, a momentum she hadn't expected to lose. Still, she pressed forward. "Emotion doesn't erase inequality," Warren said, her voice sharper now, the edge more noticeable. "And passion alone doesn't craft policy. I've spent my life writing legislation that protects our most vulnerable. What this administration proposes dismantles that legacy brick by brick." She looked directly at Karoline. "Maybe you don't see the damage yet, but history will." It was a powerful closing line meant to reassert her authority, reclaim control, and remind the room who had spent decades fighting for education reform. But the room didn't erupt. It didn't even breathe. Because Karoline Leavitt was already stepping forward, and something about the way she moved told everyone watching, she wasn't done yet. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lecture. She simply spoke. "Senator," she said, "your legacy matters. I respect it. But legacies shouldn't be shields, they should be bridges." Warren blinked. Karoline turned to the crowd. "You ask about damage. I'll tell you what damage looks like. A 9-year-old boy in Detroit reading 2 grade levels behind. A teenage girl in Mississippi dropping out because her school had no science teacher for 6 months. A high school senior in Appalachia who's never used a laptop in 2025. Now it was the audience that blinked. "You want to talk about history?" Karoline said, eyes burning. "History won't remember how loud we were. It'll remember who we listened to." She paused, letting the silence turn electric. "I'm not here to protect systems. I'm here to protect students. If that challenges old assumptions, good. If that makes people uncomfortable, even better. That means we're finally talking about the right things." Someone in the middle row whispered, "She's turning this into a movement." Camera zoomed in. A teacher near the aisle wiped their eyes. "And Senator Warren?" She didn't respond. Not because she couldn't, but because, in that moment, Karoline Leavitt wasn't arguing anymore. She was leading, and everyone in the room felt it. The thunderous applause that followed didn't just fill the room. It changed it. What had begun as a forum was now something bigger, a reckoning, a rebalancing of voices. A young press secretary was standing toe-to-toe with a political titan and winning the room not with outrage, but with conviction. Warren stood still, jaw tight, but her silence was telling. She hadn't expected a real fight, not from someone so young. Backstage, a White House aide was already texting, "She's turning this into history." And on social media, the moment had exploded. Clips of Karoline's line, "Legacies shouldn't be shields. They should be bridges," were already circulating. One TikTok video paired it with cinematic music, racking up thousands of likes within minutes. A student captioned it, "This is what leadership looks like." But inside the room, Karoline wasn't thinking about views or retweets. She was still speaking. "I didn't come here to dismantle public education," she said, walking gently away from the podium, her voice full but controlled. "I came here to honor it by challenging it to do better." She turned toward a row of teachers seated in silence. "You dedicate your lives to students. You know the system better than anyone, and you know where it's failing. I'm not asking you to agree with everything I say. I'm asking you to help us fix it. Not tomorrow, not in 5 years now." There was no shout, no theatrics, just a plea grounded in truth. And then came the applause again. This time, it wasn't polite or scattered. It was overwhelming. Senator Warren stepped back from the mic, her expression unreadable. She glanced at her staff. One of them gave the smallest of nods, not of approval, but surrender. She knew this moment no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the girl she'd tried to belittle. Karoline returned to her spot behind the podium. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She looked tired, but resolute. "This conversation isn't about who wins a headline," she said, her voice softer now. "It's about whether we're brave enough to stop defending systems and start defending students." And with that, she stepped away from the microphone. The room was on its feet, not for a party, not for a policy, but for a person who had just changed everything. The echoes of applause were still fading when the first clip hit Twitter. Then TikTok. Then the news wires. A 37-second video of Karoline Leavitt standing calmly behind the podium saying, "Legacies shouldn't be shields. They should be bridges." The camera caught Senator Warren blinking, frozen in place, the crowd rising, a student shouting from the back, "That's right!" Within minutes, number Leavitt moment was trending. By the time Karoline stepped off stage, the internet had already turned her words into fuel. Memes, video breakdowns, side-by-side comparisons. Political influencers on both sides had dropped everything to weigh in. One conservative commentator posted, "Elizabeth Warren picked the wrong 27-year-old to mess with." A moderate journalist wrote simply, "We just witnessed the future of political communication." Meanwhile, at the White House, phones lit up. A senior advisor texted, "She didn't just hold her ground, she reshaped it." Even President Trump, known for his quick social media reflexes, posted, "Karoline Leavitt showed what America's youth can do. She fights smart, proud of her." But Karoline wasn't reading headlines. Not yet. She sat backstage, water bottle untouched, scrolling quietly through a flood of messages. One caught her eye, a direct message from a high school student in Kansas. "I was told I couldn't speak at our school board meeting because I'm only 16, but after watching you today, I think I will." Karoline blinked back emotion. That was the point. This wasn't just about defending a policy or responding to a jab. This was about turning a moment of mockery into a movement of courage. Across the country, parent groups began resharing the clip, especially Karoline's remarks about parental choice and local control. One mom wrote, "I don't care who she works for. That young woman just said what every parent feels." Even neutral anchors began to shift. A CNN host said on air, "Warren came to talk policy. Leavitt came to talk people. That difference mattered today." And as the sun set on the convention center, Senator Warren's team huddled in silence. One aide whispered, "We underestimated her." Warren didn't reply, because deep down, she knew. She hadn't just lost a debate. She had helped create a star. And the whole country was watching her rise. The stage was empty now. Lights dimmed. Cables coiled. Chairs half-stacked. But in that quiet aftermath, the moment still pulsed, echoing through phones, newsrooms, classrooms, and living rooms. Inside a modest office back at the White House, Karoline Leavitt sat alone. Her blazer was off, her phone face down. The cheers had faded, but the weight of what had just happened still settling. She glanced at the television. Every major network had cut to her segment. Pundits debated the impact. Clips rolled, hashtags flashed. But Karoline wasn't watching herself. She was thinking about the students, the ones in the back row, who stood up. The messages still pouring in, not from politicians, but from teens, teachers, parents, people who, for the first time in a long time, felt seen. Her phone buzzed. A message from her mother. "You didn't just speak, Karoline. You reminded people why their voice matters. I'm so proud of you." She exhaled. That meant more than anything. But even as the praise poured in, Karoline knew the truth. This wasn't victory. It was responsibility. Her words would be quoted, clipped, even weaponized. Some would turn her into a symbol. Others would try to tear her down. And that was fine. Because today proved something. You don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to have decades of experience to speak with wisdom. You don't have to fit the mold to break it. She stood and looked out the window, DC's lights flickering below. Somewhere out there, young people were watching, wondering, waiting to be told they weren't enough. And now, maybe, they'd think twice. In a classroom in Georgia, a teacher paused her lesson to play the clip. In a small town in Ohio, a father shared the video with his daughter saying, "This could be you." In a college dorm in Arizona, a group of students watched it together silent, then nodding. That was the legacy. Not applause, but awakening. Karoline picked up her phone one last time, not to check mentions, but to reply to that student in Kansas. "Speak up. You don't need permission." She hit send. And as she turned out the lights and stepped into the hallway, she carried no script, no spotlight. Just one quiet truth. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one they never saw coming.